My name is Kyle Royer.
Oh, it's hot. It's really hot.
And I'm making my second ever sword named Excelsior.
It's even more steel than I used on my first sword.
So let's embark together on this epic edged adventure. Welcome back, guys. We've still got a long way to go on the Damascus before we can start forging out the blade for Excelsior. So let's jump right into it and get forging. I've got the two billets combined, and they're currently welded together with MIG and TIG welds, ready to go into the forge.
You might be able to barely see it still. This is the first billet that we made up. It's kind of that W billet that's modified. And this is the second billet here. This is gonna be stars. I can just barely see really faintly. We've got some big bright stars in the center and then straight layers around it. So there's kind of like a mosaic there, one there, and then these are gonna be a different mosaic that kind of interplay with this center part.
I've been working on this mosaic Damascus for 6 days straight, and it's almost ready to have its final forge welding session done to it. Right now I've got the bar surface ground, and I've also ground the edges clean, and we're ready to start cutting it up into tiles and tile welding this. It'll probably get cut up into about 16 or 17 individual tiles, and that's how we'll get the pattern of the mosaic onto the surface of the blade. Right now, the pretty pattern, the mosaic, is only on the end of the bar. So we're gonna cut it up into a bunch of tiles, and when we flip those around, it'll transfer that pattern from the end of the bar to the edges or the sides of the blade so we can actually see that pretty pattern. Otherwise, if you just use this bar like it is, it would just look like straight lines running down it, and there wouldn't be a distinct, pretty mosaic pattern to it. My bar's about 1¼ inch thick and 2 1/8 inches wide, and that should give a really good proportion to our mosaic tiles and kind of allow for me to stretch those out a little bit without adding too much distortion in by having a rectangular bar. If I made this a square bar and then tiled it, we'd end up with a pattern that looks really stretched out because the pattern wouldn't get much wider, but it would get a lot longer as we forge weld it and draw it out and everything. So I'm gonna try to keep it from getting too stretched out by having this really skinny, wide bar. I've got an old piece of mosaic Damascus here with a 35-degree angle on it already. It should be right around 35. I'm gonna use it to help get the layout for setting up the bar to be cut up into a bunch of little tiles. I'm gonna try doing a 1-inch layout and then see about how thick each tile will be, doing about 1 inch of the billet at a time. Just to get a general idea, I can put this mosaic scrap on here that has that proper angle that I want. And then we can measure about how thick the tile would be after it's cut. Because even though you're making it 1 inch long this way, when you actually cut the tile on an angle, it won't be 1 inch long necessarily, or 1 inch thick. So yeah, by the time we adjust for the bandsaw cutting out some material, we're
probably looking at just over 3/4 of an inch thick tile if we go with a 1-inch layout down the billet.
I've got the layout finished. We've got 16 tiles that we're gonna be cutting this billet up into. I also super glued the billet to this big bar of steel and got it on there nice and square with the bar. And then I took the TIG welder and put some little tiny tack welds to hold it on. I made sure to put the welds out of the way of the bandsaw blade though, because those welds are gonna be really hard because the steel around the weld gets hardened and it would destroy the bandsaw blade. So I was careful to put welds only where the bandsaw blade wasn't gonna cut. What that's gonna do is allow me to clamp this in the saw all the way up until the very end of the billet. It can be difficult once you're working with the very tiny little bit of billet that you have left to hold it in the bandsaw, but by welding it to this bar of steel, I can make sure that I can get access to the entire bar and cut the entire thing up into tiles. It's really important to square up the bar of steel with your mosaic billet, because you want the blade to cut through nice and straight. And I'm also taking time to put a new blade on my bandsaw. I always put a brand new one on every time I'm cutting up these tiles for a mosaic. And I'm making sure that the blade is cutting nice and square by cutting a couple slices off of a mild steel bar and doing little adjustments until it's cutting square with the blade. With the blade? I normally let my billet hang over my bar that I'm clamping to a little bit. But in this case, I should have put the billet back quite a bit further, at least 4 or 5 inches, because I've got to move it back so far here that it's not even on the table anymore. So I'm not used to working with a billet this long, and I made a little mistake there. I think I'm just going to take these 1 3/8 inch blocks for the hydraulic press. That should work until I get more of this bar up on the table, and then I can get rid of these and just use this bar to clamp everything tight against the backrest. I've got the mosaic Damascus billet cut up into 16 pieces, and I went ahead and ground all the mating surfaces clean to a 120 grit. That'll just help everything forge weld a little bit smoother and a little bit easier instead of leaving that kind of rough surface ground finish on there. I've also gotten rid of most of the burrs. There's some big burrs from cutting and grinding and stuff, so I've deburred the pieces. We got them all set up here. I want to show you how we want to fold the pattern and get the pattern from the end of the billet into what will be the sides of the blade. Because right now, like I mentioned before, we're only going to have straight lines going down the billet. Straight lines on the edge, straight lines on this edge. All the pattern is on the end, but we've cut all these pieces on a 35-degree angle. Now we'll lay the pattern out a certain way that will bring the pattern from the end of the billet to the edges of what will be our blade. In order to make this pattern look as good as it can, we're going to make sure each piece mirrors the piece in front of it. So that means we're going to have this edge right here meet up with this edge right here. In order to make this piece mirror with the next one, this edge right here will meet up with this edge. And then this edge here will meet up with this one, and so on, all the way through the billet. Oh. I went all the way through the billet to make sure that I was going to start with the right edges, and I actually need to start with the bottom edges because I went all the way down through here and we end up with the bad end, and the bad end won't meet up with this other end very well. So everything I just said applies, except instead of starting with this up here first, we're just going to start by mirroring on the bottom first. So we'll start here and here, and then it'll be here, and so on, all the way through. The way I like to do this is just start by moving the first piece kind of where I want it, and then go on down. So it's going to be mirrored there, it's going to be mirrored there, it's going to be mirrored on the bottom, mirrored on the top, mirrored on the bottom, mirrored on the top, mirrored on the bottom, mirrored on the top, mirrored on the bottom, top, bottom, top, bottom, top, bottom. And we can just come back here and slowly start to get them all straightened out. We should be seeing the numbers meeting up and then no numbers, and then the numbers meet up, and then one of them will be upside down and one of them will be right side up. So in my case, all the uneven numbers are upside down and the even numbers are right side up. So now we can just lay it over. These squiggly marks here represent our mosaic. So instead of the mosaic being on the end of the billet, now it's going to be all the way across what will be the sides of the sword. This thing is massive. It's about 22 inches long, and I'm going to add another 3 inches of 1084 on the end, and we'll use that for the tang. I don't want to waste this pretty Damascus steel for the tang, so we'll forge weld that on there, and it'll be just as strong as if we use the Damascus, because that's what this stuff's made out of, is 1084 and 15 and 20. The next thing I'm going to do is prepare that 1084 for the tang. I need to put angles on the end of it and get it all ready to go so I can weld it to the rest of this. We're also going to cut a section of this 52-100 off. It doesn't have to be 52-100, it's just what I happen to have that's the proper size. I want something that's just a little bit wider than my billet. We're going to use 2 pieces of this and weld our pieces down to this strip of steel and then put another piece on top like a sandwich. And that'll just help hold everything more securely. It's not necessary for small or large billets, but it's an extra security that I like to do sometimes, and it'll just help hold all the pieces in place. And you don't have to use 52-100. It can be mild steel, it can be 15 and 20, it can be just about anything as long as you can weld to your mosaic and weld to this material. You should be good to go. I've got the tile mosaic billet all ready to go to be forge welded. Instead of MIG welding or TIG welding the tiles to that piece of 1/8 inch 52-100, I changed my mind and decided I didn't need something that thick, so I just used some 1/16 inch thick sheet metal that's mild steel, cut 2 strips of that and tack welded them down, all the little tiles to one piece, put the other piece on there, welded all the seams up solid, ground the excess metal off the sides. And I had some little places where the MIG welder probably wasn't turned up hot enough, so I also went over it with the TIG welder with no extra filler and just cranked the heat up a little higher and sealed everything up. We want all the tiles sealed up really well because we're going to do the 0 atmosphere forge welding to get the best welds possible on this sword. I also got a 3-inch little extension on the end of the billet. That's 1080 steel, and that'll allow us to get the tang forged out of that without wasting a bunch of our really pretty mosaic steel. I think there might be a little more steel here than I need. I went ahead and used up the entire billet though, just because I don't want to be short, and I did not want to be short at all. So it was better to be safe and end up with maybe a little thicker blade in the end, because we can always grind more off. We can't put it back though, and if I short myself, there's no turning back to that. You'd have to make a shorter sword or a thinner sword or something like that. Next thing we need to do is forge weld all the tiles together and start shaping it into our sword blade. But before we do that, I want to prepare a pattern of the blade so that as I'm forging that blade out in the forge and we've got everything lit up, I'll have a pattern I can go by and try to get the blade forged really accurately to shape. I'm gonna try to forge the profile of the blade in really well so I can have the pattern flow with the blade. I didn't need a pattern on my first sword because it was just a tapered blade and it was relatively simple to forge the profile of the blade in. But with this sword, we've got a lot of shape going on. At the guard, it starts out really wide and then it gets skinny and then it widens back out and then you've got the very tip as well. So because of all that, I want a good pattern to go by to help me get the right shape as I'm forging this blade to shape. To start with, I'm gonna use this semi-transparent plastic material and trace my sketch onto this. Once that's done, we'll cut half the blade pattern out of this plastic material and transfer that over to this strip of 15 and 20. Then we'll shape this 15 and 20 to be half of the sword blade. And I want to try to get this really accurate because I'll use this again later after the blade's completely forged out. Once that's done, we'll use this half blade and transfer it over to another piece of steel and get the full blade cut out. And that one needs to be pretty accurate. That's the one I'm going to use for forging, but it doesn't need to be as accurate as the half blade because this is going to be the one we use to get our blade perfectly symmetrical later on. I finished my half sword template. I made it out of a 16th inch piece of 15 and 20. I made it as detailed as possible, especially on the edge of the blade, because I'm gonna probably use this for the actual template after the blade's forged out. We'll scribe lines around the blade, flip it over and scribe the other lines, and we'll have a nice symmetrical blade. I also needed this in order to make the second template that I was gonna need, and that's a full blade template. The reason I need this is for while I'm forging the blade out, I need a full blade template in order to make sure that I forge the blade pretty close to the final shape. It's not gonna be exactly 100%, but I wanted something to really go by because I want the pattern to really flow through the blade. So mostly the part I'm concerned about is this small part right here. I need to make sure I forge that in, this narrow area, to make the pattern really flow with the entire blade instead of just grinding that in. In the next video, something's off. Coffee break. Much better. In the next video, we're gonna take our mosaic Damascus billet and get that puppy forge welded together, because right now it's just a bunch of tiles that are MIG welded. We're gonna forge it together and start forging our blade out. We've got a template to go by, everything's set, it's gonna be exciting times. I will see you in the next video. May the forge be with you. Bye-bye.